Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on practical strategies for addressing challenging behaviors in autism. I'm Julie Manaharan, and I'm the project coordinator for SPARC, and we're so glad that you could join us, and we thank you for taking the time to participate in the SPARC community. SPARC's mission is to build a research community of tens of thousands of individuals with autism and their families who will be asked to register online and share genetic information via saliva kits that are sent to the home. These data are shared with SPARC researchers and will power important new research that aims to advance the understanding of autism and provide meaningful information and resources to participants. Before we begin the webinar, I just want to say a couple of things about how today's webinar will work, in case you've never attended an online meeting before. Today's presentation will be shown in a window on your computer, and the sound will come through your computer's speakers. So check your speakers to make sure they're turned up. If you're having trouble hearing the presentation, you can call the phone number at the top of the presentation browser window. We're also recording the webinar, and we'll be able to post it on SPARC's website, www.sparkforautism.org, so it can be viewed there at a later date. Also, please be aware that in order to minimize disruptions, all audio except for the presenters will be muted for the duration of the webinar. So what that means is if you speak, we will not be able to hear you. However, you can use the chat box at the left of your screen to ask questions, either technical or for the presenter, and only the leaders of the webinar will be able to read them, not everybody who's tuning in. At the end of the webinar, we'll have a few minutes for a question and answer session, which will draw directly from your questions in the chat box or from the questions that you sent via email to the email address we included in the invitation. Please note that the speaker is not able to provide advice regarding your child specifically, but she's more than happy to answer other topical questions. We'll also be holding webinars monthly on a range of different topics, so questions on those different topics can be addressed at those times. And before Bridget begins, I do want to mention that SPARC's webinars will typically be 60 minutes long. As a kickoff, though, and because this topic and Bridget will make for a particularly excellent talk, this presentation will be 90 minutes. Future SPARC webinars will all be 60 minutes. So at this time, I want to turn the webinar over to Pam Feliciano, our scientific director, to introduce our speaker.
Hi everyone, I'm Pam Feliciano. I'm the scientific director of SPARC. I'm also a parent of an 11-year-old boy with autism. I first met Bridget in 2007, just a few months after my son was diagnosed, and Bridget herself and the program available through her organization really helped me understand the types of behavioral treatments that would work for my own son. So it's an honor to have her speak with us today, and I really hope that all of you feel at the end of it that you've benefited from hearing Bridget. She is a co-founder and executive director of Alpine Learning Group, a school for students with autism. She's also the senior clinical advisor for Rethink, which provides a comprehensive web-based curriculum for special educators and ABA providers. She has been specializing in the treatment of children with autism for the past 27 years, and she's very active in the autism research community and has published numerous research articles and book chapters on effective interventions for autism. So with that, I just would like to hand it over to Bridget, and thank you again so much for agreeing to present to our SPARC community.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, SPARC, for this invitation. I appreciate people logging on for this webinar. I hope you find it helpful as you think about some of the behavioral challenges that your child presents with. I'll just give you a brief overview of what we're going to try to accomplish in a relatively short period of time. We'll talk about some of the common behavior problems that children with autism present with and get you thinking about the conditions that may actually occasion problem behavior, some of the assessment methods that you might want to employ if your child does have problem behavior, and practical strategies. And we'll leave time at the end for some questions that you might have that come up across the webinar. And there's opportunities for you to type in those questions, I understand, in a chat box, and we'll get to those questions at the end. Hopefully we'll be able to address them all. So here we have what may be seen as a typical picture sometimes in a child's home, particularly a family that has a child with autism. So I have the opportunity to work with many families, and these families all invariably will have challenges related to their child with autism's behavior. And it may be the case that I come into a home and it sometimes looks like this. It sometimes looks like a lot of disorganization, and the child is wreaking havoc in the family's home. And our goal in working with families is to really help them get back in control and really to have the family function as smoothly as possible. And it's not uncommon that we come in, and this is really the first thing that we might see where there's lots of disorganization and chaos around the child's behavior. So we know that children with autism are at risk for the development of behavior problems. So children with autism are not born having behavioral challenges. Those behavioral challenges develop over time. And we know, for example, that a child with autism might have aggression, might have self-injury, might have tantrum behavior, and might engage in repetitive behavior that doesn't appear to serve a social function. And so children might engage in movements with their hands or their body or arrange the environment in such a way that seems fairly non-purposeful to us and doesn't appear to get a social reaction from the community, but they do it instead because it's something that they find pleasing, and we call those responses either sensory-derived responses or behaviors that are typically termed self-stimulatory, and some families will say stimming, for example. Now, that's not to mention children also can present with food selectivity, and so one of the most severe cases of food selectivity that I worked with was a child whose primary food was fried bacon and A&W root beer soda. And this little guy knew when the soda was A&W root beer and when it might have been another brand. That's how precise he was able to make that discrimination. And so this was very challenging for the family. And he had survived on just these two items for probably 2 years until a very intensive food program was introduced. Children also may have sleeping problems. It's not uncommon for children to have difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, behavioral issues around where they sleep, having to sleep with mom, having to have a parent lay with them in the evening. Children might have noncompliance, so they can do a task, but they refuse to do a task, and so we call that noncompliance. And then also, children with autism might present with some idiosyncratic behavior. And by idiosyncratic, I mean things that seem highly specific to this particular child. So a child who might not want you to have your sleeves rolled down and they tantrum unless they're rolled up. Children who might want the environment arranged in a particular way, and so they control the environment, and it seems highly idiosyncratic. So this little guy I worked with engaged in a lot of climbing behavior. And so he would find his way into different areas of the house to climb higher and higher. And he found ways to climb in all different parts of the house, even getting up on and balancing on this fireplace here, and then getting up on a high cabinet. And this can be, of course, very dangerous and very disconcerting for the family. And so for this family, this was a big concern in terms of safety. For the child, he, of course, seemed to like this activity. It was highly idiosyncratic in terms of his interest and what he wanted. So why are children with autism at risk? Because they're not born with these behaviors. They're at risk for the development of these behaviors. And that's really important to know, is that behavior is a function of environmental variables and a learning history. And so it's important to know why they might be at risk. For example, children with autism have limited understanding of language. And so if they don't understand what's being said to them, they might engage in problem behavior. And so imagine a parent trying to instruct a child or to tell a child lots of things they need to do, and the child doesn't understand what's being said. So not being able to understand might lead to challenging behavior. Also, not being able to express themselves, tell us when they're hungry, tell us when they've had enough, tell us when they need a break, to tell us that they need to use the restroom, to tell us that they're tired. They're unable to communicate these responses, and that in itself can lead to challenging behavior. There's also general skill deficits. So children with autism often do not engage in imitative responses readily unless they're taught. And so if they don't imitate those around them, they're not going to imitate certain play behavior that they see their brother or sister engage in, or they may not engage in certain pro-social behaviors that they see others engage in. So the skill deficit of imitation might lead to some other behaviors that the child would engage in, such as doing odd things with objects, because they don't observe others engaged with those objects appropriately and then imitate those responses themselves. I also think children with autism, because of some of the challenges around social difficulties and comprehension, they're sensitive to what I call faulty contingencies. And so what might function as a reinforcer for one child, typically developing child, for example, might like social praise, and the typically developing child might not like to be reprimanded by mom and dad because they don't want mom and dad to be upset with them. But for a child with autism who doesn't understand the implications of those consequences, they might perceive a reprimand as pleasurable because it's a reaction from the environment. They don't necessarily comprehend and understand that that reprimand actually means mom's upset with you and you shouldn't do it. And so a reprimand might function as a reinforcer for a child, making the child do the behavior again and again to get the reprimand, whereas a social reinforcer such as praise might be perceived as unpleasant from the child with autism who doesn't necessarily want that social interaction or perceive the benefits of that type of consequence, and thereby may not engage in behavior that's positively reinforced. And so there may be some sensitivity to what I call faulty contingencies. Also, children with autism may not appreciate the standard reinforcement packages, the standard reinforcing responses that parents will provide for typically developing children. So using praise, child with autism might not appreciate that. Mom smiles, dad's appreciation. Those types of responses, those types of consequences for the child with autism may not be fully valued, and therefore behavior, pro-social behavior, fails to become shaped over time because they don't appreciate those consequences. Now, over time, we want to teach children, of course, to appreciate those consequences, but early on in treatment, we may have children with autism who don't necessarily appreciate those consequences and therefore may not engage in pro-social behavior. Now, we know that there are detrimental effects to not addressing behavior problems. And so as a behavior analyst, as someone who works closely with families, if I don't address the behavioral issues related to my students and the families who present with these concerns, then I really have not done my job as a behavior analyst and as a psychologist, because my job is really to help families address not just the learning needs of their children, but also the behavioral needs. And so we know if we don't address these needs, there's going to be consequences. So for example, there's physical consequences. If children with autism engage in aggression, they're going to get hurt. They're going to hurt others rather. If they engage in self-injury, they're going to get hurt themselves. And so there's physical consequences to children and to others in the community. There's also social and emotional consequences. And so children who engage in challenging behavior are often the children who are interacted with the less, right? So that if they're not able to, if the parent is unable to take them to the park, for example, they might be more socially isolated than another child. And there may be emotional consequences with respect to perceiving that social isolation. And so there are social and emotional consequences to children having behavioral issues. There's also educational consequences. Children who engage in problem behavior are engaged in less academic tasks. And so if a child is spending a good deal of their time engaged in tantrum behavior and aggression, they're certainly not engaged in academic tasks in order to move them along in terms of their educational potential. There's also economic consequences. So when children have behavioral issues, it can cost the family money to hire specialists. Sometimes adolescent individuals with autism have to go away to settings where their behavior can be more specifically assessed, and so that costs money. And often families who have children with autism, invariably one parent will stop working because of the care that's required of the child with autism. And so there are certainly consequences if these issues are not addressed. And the most significant detrimental consequence, of course, is on the family itself. And so families often become prisoners in some ways in their own homes because they don't go out, they don't take the risks, because the behavioral concerns that they have with their child are so significant that they're afraid the child is going to have a behavioral issue in the community, at a parent's house, and so on. So we try to work very closely with families, and we make sure that they are engaged in community activities, that they are doing family function activities, because it's important that they are engaged with activities with others for their own social support, but also that they can continue to function as a cohesive family. And so for many families, when a child has behavioral issues, they stop functioning as a family. One will stay home while the other goes to a religious service, for example. One will stay home with the child while they go to a family holiday event. And so when we start to see these things happening, we really have to get in and work closely with families to address these concerns so that they can begin to function with some relative normalcy in terms of family activities. And so I found this cartoon, and it really exemplified for me what happens to a lot of families. And the child, in many ways, controls the environment, and the family ends up changing their behavior. The parent ends up changing their behavior in response to the child, because the parent-child interaction, of course, is reciprocal, and so the child behaves in one way, and that makes the parent behave in another, and vice versa. And so our goal with families is to turn this around and to have families get back in control of their family life, of the activities that the child's engaged in, and so on. And so really taking this, looking at this cartoon and saying, well, let's reverse this and let's get the parent back in control of the situation. So the good news is, despite the detrimental effects of behavioral issues, is that parents and teachers, of course, can do a lot. They can, for example, arrange a lifestyle that reduces the likelihood that problem behavior will emerge in the first place. And so if we think about it, if children with autism are not born with behavioral issues, then and behavioral issues are a function of the environment, then it's a matter of arranging the environment in such a way, hopefully, to reduce the likelihood that behavioral problems will emerge in the first place. And I think this is important to think about with respect to if we think about other examples of this in the medical community. When heart disease was at its highest in America, the American Medical Association put out directives and said if we want to reduce the incidence of heart disease, we have to have folks arrange a lifestyle. If they're at risk, for example, of heart disease, they need to have less stress in their life, eat a low-fat diet, sleep more, exercise, and so on. And then, in fact, we were able to reduce the incidence of heart disease over time by changing people's lifestyle. Similarly, with children with autism, we want to think about, is there a way to reduce the incidence of behavior problems over time by engaging in more prevention and in having families and teaching families to create a lifestyle that might reduce the likelihood that behavior will emerge in the first place. This will require, of course, an understanding of the potential functions of behavior. We'll talk about what those functions may be. And also identifying what the environmental conditions are that might occasion problem behavior. What are some things in the environment that occur that lead to behavior, that lead to the development of behavioral issues or trigger, in a way, the behavior problem itself? It also will require that parents be proactive. And by proactive, it means planning ahead, thinking carefully about what's happening when a behavior emerges. And in a way, as a parent now, not only are you an advocate and you're a teacher, but now you're also a detective, because your goal is to figure out why this behavior is happening. And so it requires being objective and stepping outside of yourself in a way and looking at the behavior and looking at the environmental events that occur. And I'll take you through a couple of those ways to do that. So the first idea that I want to have you think about and understand is that most behavior will serve a function. And by function, I mean that the behavior gets them something. And so your job as a parent when you have behavioral issues is to figure out what is it that they're getting as a result of the behavior. And so in this example, a child doesn't want to have his hair cut and engages in tantrums. It's very common with kids with autism when we first start working with them. They don't tolerate and cooperate with certain kinds of procedures, and this is one, haircut. And so children will engage in behavior to avoid or to escape something that they experience as unpleasant. Now, what I want you to do is to broaden your understanding of what might be unpleasant. Because to us, physical and social interaction might be welcomed, but to a child with autism, that might be experienced as unpleasant. And so their problem behavior might actually occur to avoid social interaction, to avoid crowds, to avoid noise, and so on. And so there may be a function of the behavior that gets them out of something that they don't want. And so when they tantrum when their hair is being cut, mom or dad or grandma or teacher might terminate the haircut because it's hard to have a child tantruming while a haircut's going on. And so the child learns over time, if I tantrum during a haircut, the haircut will stop. Behavior might also serve the function to gain access to a tangible item or activity. And so the child might want something and can't communicate it to you. And so in order to communicate that to you, they might tantrum, they might engage in behavior that gets them something. So if I hit my brother, I get the iPad back. And so the child learns, if I engage in a behavior, things come my way, and this to get access to certain things. Behavior might also serve the function to gain access to attention. And so a child might do something to get mom or dad to pick them up, to get some kind of interaction from the parent. Now, attention can be in the form of a reprimand, don't do that, for example, or stop that, because that's attention we're providing to the behavior. We are recognizing the behavior, we're attending to the behavior, and that in itself is attention. So attention is not just being picked up. Attention is broad and can even be looking at the child engaging in the behavior. I watched a student the other day in my program who's engaging in a lot of attention-seeking behavior, and the teacher was really doing a good job ignoring the behavior. But every now and then she would look at him to make sure he was safe. And she would look at him, and he would start laughing as soon as she looked at him. So the looking was a form of attention. And we have to sometimes figure out how we're going to monitor kids where we're ignoring behavior, keep them safe, of course, but also not give any attention at all. So for some kids, even eye contact can be a form of attention. Behavior can also serve the function to gain access to sensory stimulation. And so a child, again, because of skill deficits, might engage in certain behavior that feels good to them. So they turn in circles, they get dizzy, that feels good, they keep doing it. They line their objects up in a certain way, and visually that's very appealing to them, so they keep doing that. And so the behavior doesn't serve the function of getting mom's attention or dad's attention or teacher's attention or to get out of something or to get something. It's really it's a behavior that seems to be motivated by something that they want themselves, something that feels good to them that they're engaged, that they're doing. So for example, I'm sure with the summertime coming, you're taking your children to theme parks, and it's not just children with autism at theme parks. There's adults who do not have autism waiting in line to go on rides that will hold them upside down for many minutes and spin them around. And that's because it feels good to them. They're not doing it for social approval or to get out of something. It's because they like the sensory experience. Similarly with our children, with our students, they might engage in behavior that gains access to some sensory stimulation. Now, it's important to talk about medical reasons for problem behavior. And what I always advise families and what we do here at the school is if a behavior occurs, it's never occurred before and seems to persist, we make sure that the child medically everything is okay. So we might make sure that when's the last time they went for a dental exam? Are they feeling well? Are they having regular bowel movements? Because it may be the case that the child's engaging in behavior, which may be the case that the child's not feeling well, which sets the occasion for certain behaviors to occur. And so a child might have a headache, not know how to communicate that, and engage in some self-injury of hand-to-head self-injury as a way to mitigate that feeling that they're experiencing as part of the headache. I tell the story that in one of the cases that I had in my pre-doctoral internship was with a student who wasn't able to communicate but was referred to the clinic because she was sucking on her hand, and she was sucking on her hand so severely that she was putting her hand all the way down her throat. She didn't have a way to communicate at all. And so the parents in the school were concerned because she was really, when she was putting her hand down her throat, causing damage to her vocal cords, but also to her hand, and it was very raw and red. And the good news about this place where she was brought is that they were able to do medical tests, and they did x-rays and sonograms, and they found out that she had a severe bone infection in her jaw. And so this behavior was an effort to try to soothe that feeling that she was having in her jaw, and nobody knew that, and they put her on antibiotics, and the behavior went away. So it's not always that smooth, and it's not always that easy, but I do encourage you, if you do have concerns about your children's behaviors, that you also make sure that you rule out any medical reasons. It's also important to know that behavior will serve multiple functions. So it would be easy if every behavior served one function, but it's usually not the case, at least in my experience, is that behavior often will serve multiple functions over time. And so inappropriate laughter might serve the function of getting attention, but also can get him out of work. And sometimes he does it in his room alone and it seems like it's satisfying to him, so it might be sensory as well. So behavior might serve multiple functions, and it's important to think about that as you assess and you look at behavior in terms of environmental events, is that there may be more than just one function. Okay. So let's shift gears and talk about, well, if they engage in behavior to serve function, what are some of the things that might lead to problem behavior? What are some of the conditions? And as we go through this, start to think about your child and start to think about the conditions under which you see problem behavior. And if you can begin to organize how you're looking at the behavior, recording how often it's occurring under certain circumstances, you might begin to see some patterns, and that can tell you what the function is. So for example, some events that might lead to problem behavior would be anything unpleasant. So does he tantrum when he's asked to do his homework, when you prompt him to do certain chores, if there's ambient noise in the environment, if there's social interaction directed toward him or her, does he engage in some problem behavior? Is there problem behavior around self-care routines, hair washing, haircuts, toothbrushing? So these are just some of the things that we see here at the school, that when these events occur, some children engage in problem behavior. Maybe not all the time, but some of the time, which leads us to believe that we have some work to do around these environmental events to reduce the likelihood that problem behavior will occur. We also see problem behavior when access to items or activities are denied or delayed. So being told no. Children with autism often have to learn to cooperate with that experience. And having to wait for something is also difficult for our children. And so these are skills that actually have to be taught to them. So think of your own experience pulling up to the ATM and you put your card in and the machine says money's not available. Now, we don't just smile and walk away. Probably what we do is we have some kind of we say something like darn, and we think about, now I have to go to a different bank, and we're not happy about that, right? So we might have a mini tantrum in front of the ATM machine. Well, similarly with our students is that they might engage in problem behavior because suddenly something that they've had is now denied. And when it's denied, they have problem behavior in order to get it back. And so we have to do some work with children around being able to cooperate with no and being able to wait. We also know that children will have difficulties when activities are terminated. And so when they have to stop doing something, it's challenging for them. When they have to transition from one activity to the next, that might be difficult. And then, of course, when we interrupt some of their self-stimulatory behavior or their sensory-derived behavior. And so children might like to line up their toys because they like the way it looks, and then we go in and we make a mess of the toys, and we're blocking access to something that they want. And we're interrupting that repetitive behavior, and that's challenging for children, and they want us to go away so they can go back to what it is that they were doing. And so again, thinking about, do these activities lead to triggers? Are these triggers for your child's problem behavior? And if so, then you can think about some activities that you can do, some skills that you can teach, and we'll talk about that later on in the presentation. Problem behavior might also occur when your attention is not available. Why is it that children seem to know when parents pick up the phone and have to get on the phone or have to be distracted with cooking? That's usually when you see the problem behavior for some kids who are attention-maintained kids, because they know the conditions under which you will come running, and then they typically up the ante and do behavior like this little boy putting a cord in his mouth because mom is definitely going to come running for that. And so when attention is not available, when you're busy, sometimes you might see problem behavior because that's a cue to the child that if they do something, they'll get your attention back. And so some kids are not attention motivated, some kids are, and those kids who are seem to identify the conditions when mom is most likely to respond or dad is most likely to respond. And when you're not available, that's usually when we see these behaviors. We might also see problem behavior, typically stereotypic behavior, sensory-derived behavior, when the environment is under-enriched or when the child is in an alone condition. And so when you think about a behavior that your child has, you could say, well, gee, is this occurring even if I'm not around? Is this occurring when he's in his room? Is this occurring when I don't have enough toys available, such as in the waiting room at a doctor's office? Are we seeing problem behavior that's repetitive in these contexts? It may be the case that some of these behaviors are not socially mediated, but are in fact mediated by the sensory consequence. And so if you think about yourself, if you're ever stuck in traffic, during those experiences you probably engage in highly repetitive behavior. So you're sitting in bumper-to-bumper traffic, and you might check your phone way more often. You might engage in changing the channel on the stereo. You might do certain things that you wouldn't ordinarily do if you were stimulated in other ways, if there was someone there having conversation with you, for example. And so under-enriched environments and alone conditions might lead to some repetitive behavior. We might also see problem behavior when things are confusing. And so again, keeping in mind that comprehension issue that children with autism have and the difficulty communicating. And so this, of course, is an aversive event. So children might want to escape events that are perceived as confusing because they don't understand when their reinforcers are coming, and they don't understand when they're going to, how long they have to be in a certain place. And so if you have a typically developing 4-year-old, you can start to say, we can't do this now, but we're going to do it on Tuesday when Aunt Jane comes, and then we're going to be able to do it again next Thursday. So all that information to that child is processed, and it mitigates their tendency to engage in challenging behavior because they can understand what's being said to them. So children with autism might have challenges when there's a lot of verbal information directed to them and they don't understand, or if they enter new environments, taking them to a grocery store, for example, a brand new environment they've never been. They don't understand what's expected of them. They don't understand certain stimuli that are presented, and so we might have behavior that leads to escape. The good news is we know that if we give children cues, and we use lots of visual cues with children to help them understand what some of these stimuli mean, that we can have a reduction in problem behavior, and we'll talk about some of those strategies. So these are the conditions that I want you to think about in relationship to your child. I want you to think about these conditions: demands, denied access, attention diverted, under-enriched environments. Think about these conditions and then have an understanding that in these conditions, if you see problem behavior, it may be because they want to escape. If it's demand, they may want access to a tangible if it's been denied. They may want your attention if your attention's diverted, or they may want sensory stimulation if it's an under-enriched environment. And so understanding the conditions and then the potential reasons can point you in the direction of what you can teach instead, and then what you can do to reduce the behavior. So let's talk about some practical strategies. The first thing that I always try to get parents and teachers to think about is, what do we want to see the child do instead? So if the child's tantruming because he's been denied access to a cookie, well, we want to teach him to wait because that's a more functional skill than tantruming. Or we want to teach him to ask for the cookie. And so as parents, sometimes, and I know my teachers are the same way in many ways, they want an intervention for the behavior. And I'm always thinking about, well, what do we want to see instead? What do we want to teach? What skills is he lacking that if we teach those skills, we'll see less behavior? And so these are some things that you want to teach your child. And if they're not in your child's IEP, get your teachers to add these into the IEP at the next IEP meeting, because these are really good skills to teach. Now, if your child can't speak, children will often use augmentative systems, and I'm sure that those of you who have children who may not be speaking clearly are using things like Proloquo or applications, different applications, or maybe you're using PECS or Sign. So even if you're using other systems, you want to think about how you can teach these skills with the system that the child is proficient in. So for example, teaching to ask for tangible items, teaching them to ask for activities, to ask for attention. It would be great if a child can learn to ask for things as opposed to throwing his toys to get mom's attention, right? So being able to ask for attention as opposed to throwing the toys to get attention. To ask for a break, to ask for more time with something, right? So when a child can't terminate from an activity, has trouble terminating from an activity, and they start to tantrum, we're sorry, the iPad's all done, and then we get a tantrum, is that if we teach them to say, can I have more time, many ways that reduces the challenging behavior, because now they have a way to express that they want more time. Now, of course, we have to deny it again, and then they learn another skill of having to cooperate, but at least having that intermediary response, that ability to communicate that they want more time, can be helpful. To ask for another turn, to ask to terminate something that they experience as unpleasant. So for escape, maintain behavior, this can be a very functional skill. Teaching your child to wait for things, waiting for not only tangible items, but also your attention. So if you have a child with attention maintained behavior, being able to teach them when they call your attention and you say, wait please, let's not interrupt, and they learn that skill, that's a real important skill, because that means they can wait for longer periods of time without engaging in disruptive behavior. Being able to share toys. So kids who have restricted access tantrums, they don't want anybody to take their toys. Well, what we really want to do is we want to teach sharing, right? We want them to be able to share their toys so that they have less challenging behavior. Teaching appropriate play with toys. So if you have a lot of repetitive behavior that doesn't appear to serve a social function, what kinds of play skills do they have, and can we teach more of those skills? Teaching them to work for delayed contingencies and working for longer periods of time. When I say delayed contingencies, what that means is working for a reinforcing consequence, but doing it for a longer period of time. So usually when we start working with children, they're getting reinforced a lot, right? Every time they do something, we give them a reward. Now we want them to work for longer periods of time, which shapes their ability to be engaged in some of these more aversive task demands for longer periods of time. And we use picture activity schedules. I'll talk about those as we move through the presentation. But those can be, using picture activity schedules can help with providing visual cues about what's going to happen next and what kinds of activities we expect them to be engaged in. So I'm going to have you watch this video. This is from the Rethink training curriculum on behavior. And I'm just going to show you the last part because it shows some exemplars of teaching and some things that you can do. If you're interested in more information on this particular curriculum, I can answer some questions at the end. I'll have you watch.
Problem behavior. Step 4. Potential ways to reduce the problem behavior. Here are some potential ways to reduce the problem behavior.
This is stop. Look at the star. Push the star. Oh.
If the student is engaging in a problem behavior because he wants an item, do not provide the item until he demonstrates appropriate behavior.
Hands down. On your lap.
Teach him to ask for the item instead.
Oh, put your hands down first. On your lap. Right there. Look, do you want the timer? Okay, hold on. Can I have timer, please?
Can I have a timer, please?
Yay! Good asking and looking at me. Nice job, buddy.
Teach him to wait for the item.
Okay, this is waiting. Wait. 1. Wait. 1, 2, 3. Good.
When denying requests, you can offer something else before a problem behavior occurs.
Oh, you know what? I need you to wait just a minute, please. But you can have this while you wait.
If the student is engaging in problem behavior to avoid or escape a task, continue to present the task.
Do this. You ready?
Keep working and provide rewards for completing the task.
What color? You got it, smart guy, blue.
Provide more frequent rewards. In this example, when the student puts his hands on his lap,
Put your hands on your lap.
the teacher praises him enthusiastically.
Oh my gosh, good boy. Good. Look at me. Good.
And when he follows the instruction,
Point to the one you drink with.
she immediately gives him a reward.
Yes, you did it. Good boy. All right.
You can also teach the student to request help or a break.
What does the butterfly do first?
Wait, I don't know.
Okay, relax. You can say, I forgot.
I forgot.
Oh, say,
What you said?
just say, can you raise your hand and say, help me?
Help me.
If the student is engaging in problem behavior because it may be self-sensory, redirect the student to something else, such as keeping his hands on his lap or playing with toys appropriately.
Let's put them in. Boom. Nice job.
Set up practice sessions of these alternative skills.
Keep your hands still. Here you go.
If the student is engaging in a problem behavior because she wants attention, do not provide attention when she is engaging in the behavior. Instead, wait for the student to do something you would like her to do.
Good. Ready? Match.
Reward her appropriate behavior.
Wow, good job.
You can also teach the student ways to request your attention.
You can say, tickle me. Tickle me. Good, looking up. I'm going to count to 5. 1, 2, 5.
Problem behavior.
Okay, so let's move through some other specific examples for you to engage in that might be more proactive. If you have a child who might engage in noncompliance, which means you want them to do something and they refuse to do it, or they might engage in tantrum to escape the task, it's very important from the outset that you be very clear when you place demands. So it's not uncommon for families to present directions in the form of a question. So they might say, do you want to clean up now? And really what we want to do is change that to a directive. Put your toys away, please, or clean up now, or clean up, please, right? So that's stating what you want as opposed to a question. And we always, the old saying, if you ask a silly question, you're going to get a silly answer. And so I always tell families, never present the directive as a question because you might get no. And so we really want families to present, if they mean business, they want to present it as a directive. Make your instructions short and specific. Keep in mind, sometimes we may think a child understands a whole lot more than they may really understand. And particularly if it's in a new environment, to use the least amount of language as possible and be very clear with what the instructions are. And so stating, Billy, come here, is very clear as opposed to all of this other language. And so when families present instructions to children, children often learn, well, I'm probably not going to have to respond until the third or fourth time the parent asks me to do this, right? And so they might delay they might delay responding to that instruction. They may also not respond because they simply don't understand. And so children may hear one or two words in all of this information. And so keeping the language specific, being clear, not using a lot of language and stating it as a directive as opposed to a question can help increase compliance. It's also important to identify a reinforcer contingency. So you may think, well, he should just clean up his toys anyway. He shouldn't need a reinforcer for doing it. But for our children, they often require some incentive or motivation, particularly when they're learning a new skill from the outset, right? And so identifying some type of reinforcer contingency, we call these when-then statements. When you do this, then we can do that. And so when you clean up your toys, then we can go watch your favorite movie. When you clean up your toys, then we can go have your snack. So that tells the child very clearly what behavior is expected and what will follow. And so if you've been having difficulty engaging your child in particular responses and they've been non-compliant, think about whether you can start using when-then statements much more clearly so that the child knows what incentive is involved there for him. Stating the direction only once, making sure that you follow up with prompts if necessary. So prompts are anything that you do that helps facilitate the response. So if I say clean up the toys, if I say when you clean up the toys, then we can go outside, and the child still refuses to do it, I'm going to take his hand and I'm going to show him how to clean up the toys because I'm going to follow through with that language. It's really important for children who have autism, and particularly early on, they don't understand a lot what's said to them, right? They have comprehension issues. So by you stating a directive and then following up with a prompt helps reinforce that language, helps them understand, oh, when I hear this, this is the action that's required of me. That can start to build the relationship between hearing the directive and then following up with that response themselves. Provide praise and reinforcers, of course, following responses, and so don't underestimate the power of identifying functional reinforcers for children and then using them in order to facilitate more compliance and helping the child understand that you're pleased and happy when they perform these responses without your assistance. So one of the things you can also do is to use pictures or lists to signal task requirements. And so using photos of what's expected of them. For example, if they're going to go shopping and then they're going to go to the park, or they're going to go to the dentist and then they're going to get to go somewhere afterwards, using photos to help them understand what's expected, using lists if they can read. Sometimes you can create a predictable routine that builds in the incentive. And so after you brush your teeth, then you can watch your favorite movie before bed, or put your shoes on before you go outside. And so you can start to build some routines in your home where you can get compliance, where the naturally occurring activity afterward is the reinforcer for the response where there's been some noncompliance. And so figuring out sometimes how you can modify and alter the routines within your home to increase compliance with some of these tasks that they've been historically noncompliant with. So this is just an example we might use with a student. We might say, first we're going to go to the doctor, then we're going to go to the playground. So the child knows that a pleasurable activity is following the doctor visit. We might even have a visual that breaks down the doctor visit. First, the doctor is going to check your heart, then he's going to check your ears, then he's going to check your eyes, then he's going to, do something if it's, for some of our students, they even learn to cooperate with having blood drawn. So whatever it is, we provide lots of predictable signals for the child to know what's coming, and that in itself can reduce some of the challenging behavior. Think about yourself. Think about how you like to know predictably what is going to happen across your day, and when you go to have certain medical procedures, you like to know what's going to happen. And so similarly for our children who may not understand the language, the pictures can help them understand what kinds of events will occur. For demands that have multiple steps or require a period of time, for example, toothbrushing, I can't tell you how many families will come to us in the beginning and say, I have to put him in a headlock to get his teeth brushed. And they're not kidding when it's two people to hold him down to brush his teeth. And so we back way up and we assure them in consultation with the dentist that if we don't get his teeth brushed thoroughly for a few days, it'll be okay, but we're going to slowly build up his ability to cooperate with toothbrushing. And typically what we'll do is we'll start with very simple responses related to toothbrushing, just doing one stroke, then two, then three, and then four, and then so on, and so that we slowly shape up the child's ability to cooperate with that experience, and eventually over time they get used to it. And the parents, of course, worry about the child's teeth, but in the end, the child is able to cooperate with toothbrushing. And so by slowly shaping participation with the task and using things like counting to cue them for how long they're going to be having to have their teeth brushed can reduce some of those challenging behaviors. Using timers for how long the task will be, perhaps if it's a long task that they have to engage in, setting a timer. Does he have to sit for the whole 20 minutes of mealtime? Can he sit for 5 and then he's done? And then next time he sits for 8 and then he sits for 10, 15, and so on until you build it up. using stickers or tokens to cue the number of trials that the child has to do before he gets a break. And so again, using those visual cues, using those timers, and those counting mechanisms can reduce some of the behaviors associated, some of the behaviors that might be escape related. So here's just an example where we might have the child brush for a certain number of strokes, and then we would stop, and then we would slowly build up over time. So if your attention has to be diverted, if you're talking about, if you're concerned with behavior that might occur as a result of you being preoccupied or busy and unable to attend to the child because he wants your attention, you might set the child up with preferred activity and then provide regularly scheduled attention. Now what that means is if the child wants your attention and you give him attention on some fixed schedule, every 15 minutes, for example, you go in and check on him. Maybe at first it's every minute. You going in and talking to him or playing with him every so many minutes decreases the likelihood that he will engage in behavior to get your attention because he's getting it anyway. He's getting your attention anyway, and so the incentive to engage in behavior diminishes. And so we call that fixed time attention, or scheduled attention, where the parent is instructed to periodically schedule their attention in conditions where they know they can't be available or their attention might be diverted. So a parent might wear a timer. They might set their phone to go off every minute, and they'd go in and they'll interact with the child, and they'll say, I'll be back in a minute, and then they'll come back in. And again, the incentive to engage in the behavior that got them attention in the first place decreases because they're getting attention anyway. Also, rotating activities, so making sure that you're using lots of different activities when you're not available to provide as frequent attention, because those activities might compete with their interest in your attention. And so those activities might provide other reinforcers that the child can gain access to other than your attention. And also letting the child know when your attention will be available. So sometimes we set the child up with a timer, and the parent says, when the timer rings, I'm going to come back and play with you, so that the child knows when your attention is available. If you have to deny access to an activity, if you have to tell them no, they can't have something, provide a reasonable alternative before the problem behavior is demonstrated. And so a reasonable alternative, there's always something a child can have, right? So rather than saying no and no is no, it might be no, you can't have, I'm sorry you can't have a cookie right now, but you can have some water, or you can have an apple. Or we can't play with that right now and you can play with this. And so some children will accept that alternative and some children may not. They might reject it and continue to tantrum, right? But at least you've started out with some proactive measure of offering an alternative. Letting the child know when he can have access, so using a timer. You can't play with this right now, but when the timer rings, we can play. Your brother's playing with it right now. When the timer rings, you can have it back. And reinforcing the child for accepting and cooperating with denied access. So when you say, I'm sorry you can't have that now, but you can play with this toy, and they accept that alternative, make sure that you provide lots of praise for that response, because accepting alternatives is a skill in itself. When you have to terminate or transition the child from an activity, you want to prepare the child for termination. So you might say, we're going to be done in 5 minutes, or we're going to leave the park in 5 minutes. So we're giving the child some time, we're preparing them. We might set timers. We might say, when the timer rings, we're going to leave the park. We provide reinforcers for cooperating with the transition, but we also might transition to a moderately preferred activity. So it's hard for kids to leave the park and then get in the car and go home and take a bath and get ready for bed, because that's the ending of something very pleasurable. Think of ourselves when we come back from vacation. I usually like to have a couple of days before I come back to work. So I'll come back on a Friday, and then I have my weekend, and then I come back to work. So I'm not going from the plane to sleep and then to work the next day. That's a hard transition for me. So we might have the child transition to a moderately preferred activity. So we might have them, we might say, we're done with the park, but we have some chips in the car. Or we're done with the park, but we're going to go home and watch your favorite movie. And so that they're transitioning to something less, maybe not as reinforcing as the park, but something else that they might want to go to that can be that bridge between leaving the park and going home. Now, if your child engages in challenging behavior, what should you do in the moment? Now, what you want to do is try to respond in a way that disrupts the response-reinforcer relationship. Now, what does that mean? Well, think about it. If the child engages in a behavior and then you yell at the child, you might say, "Stop it, don't do that." We call those reprimands. You are, in effect, strengthening the potential that hitting, which is the response, is followed by something that could potentially be a reinforcer, in this way, in this case, a reprimand. So the response of hitting is reinforced by the reprimand. And by doing that over and over again, you strengthen the relationship between the response and a reinforcer. And in this case, we have aggression leads to people yelling at the child, and yelling might be a perceived reinforcer. Now, the only way we know if it's a reinforcer is if the behavior occurs again and again and increases in frequency. But what's important is that in the moment, you think before you respond to mitigate any potential response-reinforcer relationship. So what that means is becoming very conscientious about your own behavior in relationship to your child's behavior. So that takes some objectivity, that takes some analysis of your own behavior. It also takes some communication with other people in the child's life so that you can keep each other in check in terms of how you're responding to behavior. So if you ask the child to do something and they immediately fall to the floor in tantrum, and then you say, "Okay, fine, we don't have to do it," you're strengthening the relationship between falling on the floor and escape as a reinforcer. Now, there may be many reasons why we would back off, and we'll talk about some of those. But in this case, what you want to think about is, well, if I do back off here, I'm potentially strengthening the response, falling to the floor, and escape as a reinforcer. So by yelling in this example, we potentially strengthen the relationship between hitting and the attention here, which is yelling in this case. So here's an example. The child falls to the floor, and the mom is assessing her own behavior. And she's saying, "He's having a tantrum because he wants me to carry him, and if I carry him now, he will tantrum the next time he wants me to carry him." That's because carrying him will strengthen the relationship between falling to the floor and a social reinforcer, in this case being picked up. And again, there may be many reasons why you'd pick a child up and just keep moving when you're out in public. I understand that. But in the main, what you want to do as a parent is begin to think about, well, my response potentially can strengthen this behavior. So I want to think about what's the way to interact with this child right now? What's the way to respond to this behavior right now that at least mitigates it? So in the next example here, the father says, "Oh, he's throwing his toys while I'm on the phone. It looks like he wants some attention. I'll stay on the phone, and when he's playing nicely, I'll talk to him." And of course, easier said than done. I realize that. But in the main, again, you want to think about how does your behavior potentially reinforce the response. Now, it may be the case that the child engages in behavior that's perceived as dangerous, and so you can't ignore it, right? We can't ignore. If the child's climbing on the windowsill or doing something dangerous, you can't say, looks like attention, I think I'll just ignore it. But you have a choice. You have a choice. You could either run over screaming and yelling and take him down, or you can walk over assertively, don't make eye contact, remove him from the windowsill, and have no interaction. Now, that secures his safety. And yes, you respond to the behavior, but you do it in a way that decreases the likelihood that you'll strengthen a response-reinforcer relationship. In this case, potentially social attention. So it's important that you always think about safety and that you always respond in a way that's going to make the situation as safe for the child and as for you as possible. But there are choices for how to go about doing that. So it may be the case that a child engages in tantrum behavior to avoid or escape something. It may be that you can only get part of the task done, but at least you got some of it done, right? So it decreases the likelihood of the response-reinforcer relationship of a demand and escape in that case because you're prompting for partial participation at least. So when interrupting the behavior, and I get it, it's easier said than done, try to be as neutral as possible. Try to avoid eye contact. Limit your language. There's been some research that's indicated that children will children, typical children, will follow do requests as opposed to don't requests more often. And so a do request is please sit down in the chair as opposed to don't climb on the couch. So don't climb on the couch is less likely to be followed, but please sit down is more likely to be followed. So stating your requests as what they should do as opposed to what they shouldn't do. And of course, try to stay as calm as possible. Not always possible, but again, this is something that you want to kind of try to rehearse over a period of time. So here the parent is saying, get down please, and that's a more desirable direction for a child who might be climbing on the couch as opposed to, yelling, don't climb on the couch. Because in this example, the response reinforcer relationship of climbing and getting mom's attention is strengthened as opposed to this response, which it mitigates that to some degree. Now, if you're concerned about a behavior problem that your child currently has, what can you do? Well, the first thing you want to do is think about, is to define what you're concerned about. What is the behavior that concerns you? Because if you want to change that behavior, you have to know what it looks like. And if you want other people in the family to be able to respond accordingly, they have to know what to look for as well. And so I'm sure this is familiar to those of you who might have your children involved in different types of intervention programs, but we would typically define the behavior in objective terms. We would assess the behavior. Now, when we assess the behavior, we look at behavior in terms of the environmental variables that we just talked about. We look at we try to identify what the potential function of the behavior is. And by looking at the environmental events that occur before the behavior, we call those antecedents, and those that occur after behavior, we call those consequences. When we assess behavior, we're looking at it in relationship to what's occurring just before. Did mom just give a demand? And then did mom just say he could take a break? We look at the relationship of those things in terms of when the behavior occurs and when it doesn't. We then would develop interventions, assess our interventions, and modify those interventions over time. And so when people are concerned about a particular behavior, typically they're taken through these steps. I highly recommend that if you have a concern about your child's behavior, that you try to work closely with somebody who has an understanding of behavioral assessment methodology, because they can guide you through how to do some of these things. But it's been my experience, and there's been some recent research to document this, that parents can be taught to implement these analyses on their own and can, in fact, develop intervention plans on their own. There are some published assessment tools that are out there. Functional assessment procedures are descriptive in nature, and so we call those ABC analyses, and that's the process of identifying the conditions under which you see the behavior and the consequences that follow so that you can look for patterns. And then they have scales. There's different scales that are available. One is called the Motivational Assessment Scale by Mark Duran. And that looks at that's a checklist that you would define the behavior that you're concerned about, and then you'd begin to fill out the checklist as to when the behavior is occurring and under which conditions and the consequences that follow. And then there are what we call analog functional analyses, and those are experimental analyses that document, that manipulate some of these consequences and manipulate some of these antecedent variables so that you can see under which conditions the behavior might occur more often. So, and I'll show you some data to illustrate that. So the first thing we would do is define the behavior, and here's an example. Yells when it's time for homework. That should say bang, sorry, it says dance. Bang desk with fist, rips paper. So this tells us what the behavior looks like. And then we would assess the behavior. So we would set up a time during the day to observe the behavior, and we would note the activity where the behavior is occurring, and we would note the activity that occurs after the behavior. So what occurs before, what occurs after tells us whether there's some predictable context when this behavior occurs. Because once we have that predictable context, we can then think about interventions. So here's an example of a graph that shows a functional analysis that we did on a student who had self-injury. And we did a an experimental analysis, and we identified that the behavior occurred more often in the attention condition, which means that he seemed to engage in self-injury to get a form of attention from us. Now, once we have that information, we can then develop intervention. And so you see that the open circles is the highest, and that means that he's doing it to gain attention, whereas the other conditions, it's lower. It's still occurring, but not as much. So this tells us the primary function appears to be to gain access to attention, and then we would develop an intervention. These data, on the other hand, are a functional analysis for behavior that appeared to be sensory in nature, and so this is hand movements, and so you can see that this is occurring across all conditions. We call these data undifferentiated, and if it's occurring across all conditions, it's an indication that the behavior might function to gain access to sensory stimulation. Now, it may be that it's just multiply maintained, but you can see that it's occurring a lot in the alone condition, which tells us that the stereotypic hand movements might be sensory, might be maintained by sensory consequences. So when we think about intervention strategies, there's at least 3 general approaches that are implemented. The first are, what can we do to alter the antecedent variables? So what can we do to alter those conditions, such as low attention, denying access, task demands, and so on. And then what can we do to alter the consequence variables, eliminating, for example, the source of reinforcement. And then, of course, teaching alternative behaviors, which we talked about. So this is a chart that illustrates some of the function-based treatments that you might implement. And by function, it means it's linked to the identified function. So if we know that the behavior is maintained by escape, we might implement extinction. We might teach a functional alternative to ask for a break. We might implement fixed time attention, which means that, I'm sorry, not fixed time attention, fixed time access to a break, which means they get a break on a fixed schedule every so many minutes or so many seconds. Or we might implement what's called a DRO, where we reinforce when the behavior is not occurring. So again, I'm providing this chart for you to see that if you can identify the function, you can then logically link that function to various treatments. So let's go through these quickly. Much of this I have already discussed, but we'll just recap by going through when the behavior is maintained by attention. When you've determined that, the first thing you want to do is to not provide attention if possible. Again, easier said than done. We want to teach the child the skill of asking for attention in more appropriate ways. We want to make sure that we schedule attention and make it predictable. We want to make sure the child's taught the skill of waiting for attention. And then we want to make sure that we provide attention when the behavior ceases. So these are different interventions that you can implement if you determine that the behavior is in fact maintained by some form of attention. I want to say that whenever you implement extinction, something happens. Behavior usually gets worse before it gets better. We call that an extinction burst. And often, families and teachers will abandon interventions just when they get started because they say it's not working, it's getting worse. So if we say to a parent, listen, I want you just to ignore these tantrums, we're going to ride it out, we're not going to pay any attention to it, I want you to go about, do what you got to do as long as he's safe, we're going to monitor him, we're not going to provide attention for this behavior. Invariably, it will get worse because the reinforcer of attention was there for so long that the child will engage in the behavior, sometimes do things that they've never done before to get that attention back. And then families will say it's not working. And so it may be that there's been a partial extinction burst, and we haven't really fully worked through that. And of course, working with a certified behavior analyst can guide you through some of these interventions and work with you on assessing the data and looking at whether it's working or not working. But suffice to say that invariably sometimes behavior will get worse before it gets better. If behavior is maintained by escape, we want to work hard to not allow escape. But I have young men in my school who are 20 years old and 6'2" and 175 pounds, and if they engaged in problem behavior in order to escape a task, I don't think I could do an extinction protocol with them. It would be unsafe for teachers if they had aggression, for example. And so I say to provide to do extinction, but I think you have to think carefully about whether extinction is functional and whether you can ignore behavior or not allow escape when you're talking about dangerous behavior, particularly if you're talking about things like self-injury or aggression. We want to teach the skill of asking for a break, so making sure the child has the skill of being able to terminate things that they don't want. Make your breaks predictable. So how long does the child have to work before they have to take a break? How long will this unpleasant experience go on for? Helping them understand that it will end soon, giving them those signals. We want to make sure there's lots of incentives for participation in the task. One of the biggest mistakes I think teachers make and sometimes families make is that we take away the support of using reinforcers or incentives. And the truth is the world can be pretty challenging for kids with autism. And so having that incentive there, we'd love them to go to get their hair cut without any incentive. That would be great. But they may still need an incentive even at the age of 12, that when you finish this haircut and you comply, we're going to get access to something desirable. And that incentive can help motivate them to participate in the task. We want to make sure we're rewarding compliance with the task. And so not only do we want to block, we might want to block escape from the task, but we want to make sure there's an incentive for participation and rewarding them for the compliance. When the behavior is maintained by tangible, not providing the tangible, so we call that tangible extinction. The child wants the cookie, you've said no, you've offered an alternative, being proactive, offering an alternative, they've denied the alternative, they don't want that, and they're still tantruming. Well, you don't want to provide the cookie, as hard as it may be to ignore the tantrum. Again, securing safety, making sure that everybody in the environment is safe, but if you provide that cookie, then the child, the response of the tantrum is reinforced at that point. Offering reasonable alternatives prior to the behavior, we talked about that. We call this redirect, walk away, and secure safety. And so if the child wants something, you've already redirected them to something, making sure that you're not providing any tangible items while they're engaged in that behavior if there's a safety issue. And so making sure that you are providing extinction of the item that they asked, offering the alternative, but if they deny it, then putting that tantrum behavior, that problem behavior on extinction at that point. Again, using cues, we've talked about these interventions, teaching waiting, teaching the child to ask for more time. All of these skills, when we know the behavior is maintained by a tangible item, these skills can help reduce the likelihood that they will engage in problem behavior because they have a way, they're learning skills, and they have a way to communicate when they do want more as opposed to tantruming. Okay, let's watch this video. It's another Rethink video.
Cooperating with termination of preferred activities. Objective: teach the student to maintain appropriate behavior when preferred activities are ended. Here's an example.
Play with your toy. In a few minutes, we're going to be all done with the toy. You're all done playing with your toy. Here you go, buddy.
Okay, so in that example, you saw that the teacher provided the cue to him before the activity was ending. In a few minutes, we're going to be done. So he gets a warning. And then when she is taking the item, when it is time to finish, she gives him an edible. She gives him a little snack item as a way to reinforce relinquishing the phone, which he really wants to play with. And so this video, if I showed the whole thing, would take you through the teaching steps for that. Unfortunately, we don't have time for that right now. But if you're interested, I can tell you more about that resource. But there are a series of steps that you would take the child through to teach that specific skill. If you identify that the behavior is maintained by sensory stimulation, you would block the behavior so that he can't practice that behavior. We might redirect to more appropriate behavior, and we might identify similar similar but appropriate alternative activities. So if the child likes a lot of vestibular stimulation, they like to jump a lot, we teach them to jump on the trampoline, we have them learn to rollerblade, ride their scooter. If they like a lot of visual stimulation, we'll teach them to play different kinds of puzzle games on the iPad, so that you're not denying that sensory experience, but you're trying to identify a functional way for them to access that same sensory experience. Now, certain self-stimulatory behavior you can't find a functional alternative for. It may be the case that you're going to just continue to block that and then reinforce some appropriate alternative behavior. Okay, let's see. We're running out of time. So I want to, because we're going to have to shift to questions now. But if behavior is maintained by sensory stimulation, teaching alternatives and teaching play and leisure skills are essential. Here is a resource that I find very helpful, a very clearly written book on how to teach children with autism to follow activity schedules. There's been a lot of research on the use of activity schedules to prompt independence and to prompt play behavior. I encourage you to obtain this resource. It's very helpful and it's very easily written, very easily understood because it's very clearly written. Now, another intervention might be to reinforce the non-occurrence of a behavior for a predetermined interval of time. And so what we will do is teach children to not do the behavior. So we'll say, when you do X, when you play with your toys and you do not do this behavior that we're concerned about, you will get access to a reinforcer. And we teach children the system. This isn't something that you can just implement and they understand it. It's something that you have to actually take them through a series of teaching steps. But I bring it up here because I want you to know that this is another intervention that you can implement to decrease behaviors. These are some resources. Again, this will be available on the Spark website. These are some studies that we published on the use of certain stimuli to reduce challenging behavior and implementing, for example, a DRO for reducing vocal stereotypy and some motor stereotypy, and using DRO schedules like the one that I just showed you. For more information about how to address challenging behavior, here's some more resources. And here's some books that I find very helpful, and I refer these to families. There's a great book called Optimistic Parenting, Hope and Help for You and Your Challenging Child by Mark Duran, a book on sleep, and a book on eating. I thank you for your time, and we'll go to some questions now.
Hi, Bridget and everyone else. This is Julie. Thank you so much. That was an incredibly informative and useful presentation. We've gotten a lot of great questions from our webinar participants. The research assistant here at Spark has been collating them, and he's going to read some questions off for you now, Bridget.
Great.
Hi there, this is Vincent. So we have a question here. What strategies would you recommend to young adults on the spectrum to help them channel stimming behaviors into socially acceptable ways in order to help them preserve their social viability?
So based on the talk that I just gave, I would try to identify functional alternatives that might be more socially appropriate. So I don't know what the behavior is of concern with this particular young man or woman, but identifying ways for the child to do a similar behavior that's more socially appropriate, as we talked about. So some of the children who like vestibular activity, getting them involved in more gross motor activities that might serve the same function. It may be the case that for higher functioning folks with autism that they can learn to self-monitor their behavior. I have some videos on that. I didn't incorporate that in this lecture because there's so much to talk about and share, but we often will teach an individual as they get older and their comprehension is better to self-monitor their own behavior, so that if they have, for example, we have a young man who engaged in hand-flapping behavior, but very high functioning, but nonetheless had a hand-flapping behavior, and we felt that that behavior was stigmatizing. We taught him to inhibit that behavior through self-monitoring. We're actually going to be submitting that case for publication because we have a whole sequence of steps of how to teach self-monitoring that we included. So depending on the functioning level, it would there are different interventions that could be available. But again, looking at the function, making sure that the behavior that the individual is engaging in, if it is sensory, you'll have to you would identify that through assessment and then develop interventions based on what you've determined. But I'm not so sure that it's sensory, but unless an assessment's been done. So one, I would encourage you to assess the behavior and look objectively, determine objectively if it is in fact sensory, and then if it is, depending on the functioning level, implement interventions to either teach the individual to monitor that own behavior themselves, or perhaps a DRO schedule where they're being reinforced for the non-occurrence of the behavior and for doing something else. Next question.
All right. What techniques have you used that are effective when a situation has escalated to screaming level and your teenage autistic child does not think they need to take a break?
Great question. You're talking about a behavior, in the moment the child is not able to remove himself from the situation. Again, I can't speak specifically to this particular child and behavior, but I can tell you what some of the things that we've done, which is to teach children outside of the context of the tantrum, of the screaming, to excuse themselves. So they are actually on a skill acquisition program of following the direction, please excuse yourself, which means that they should walk to a location, sit in a chair, do some breathing. We teach a lot of relaxation for the students who can understand how to engage in those responses. Again, it's not for every student. And they engage in something else in that environment. And we teach that outside of the episode. We actually use a stimulus so that we give them a red card or a green card or something. It might even be something that they match to the wall in the room. And we hand it to them. We say, please excuse yourself. They go in the room. They match the stimulus. They sit in the chair, and they engage in whatever exercises we have them do. And then they get reinforced for doing that. Their responses of doing those, engaging in those responses are reinforced. And then the likelihood that they might follow that direction in the middle of a tantrum increases because it has a history of those responses being reinforced. So pre-teaching on how to excuse yourself outside of the context of the tantrum with the hopes that it might increase the likelihood that they will respond to that cue in the middle of an episode. No guarantee, of course. So again, working with professionals to help guide you how best to manage that is really important.
Bridget, I know we're coming to the end of our time here. We have a couple more minutes if you have a couple more to answer a few more questions.
Sure.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So you talked about timers. As someone was asking if children get used to timers for every activity, is it okay if they get used to it?
Well, I'm okay with certain stimuli being used to help create predictability for the child. Obviously, we want to fade certain stimuli that might be more stigmatizing. All of us rely on certain stimuli ourselves to cue us when to engage in certain behaviors, when things will end, when things will begin. And thanks to technology, everybody walking around with a cell phone now, a child walking around with a cell phone that signals for them that something's going to end or provides them with a schedule is not stigmatizing anymore because most of us are walking around with these stimuli. So I guess I would wonder why we would want to fade it. And if we did want to fade it, could we fade it to something that would be less stigmatizing if that's the concern? Over time, I find that as children are less engaged in less problem behavior around the termination of activities, those types of things like timers are not necessarily needed. But I certainly wouldn't be concerned if some type of stimulus continued to be needed if that's what was helpful for the child. I guess I would just question why we would be eliminating it, but maybe perhaps looking at making the stimulus a little bit more age appropriate or more socially acceptable based on what's in the child's environment.
Okay. So you talked about avoiding eye contact when addressing behaviors, and when children become more upset that you don't look at them. So the question is, if you're continuing to avoid eye contact, when the child acknowledges that, I guess kind of just how to figure that out. If the
What is it?
Here, I'm gonna have Pam take a look at this
Okay.
question.
All right. The parent's saying when you avoid eye contact and the child becomes more upset, how do you handle that? Yeah. So I guess you're only avoiding eye contact when they're seeking your attention. But I guess the question is, if you do that and the child gets more upset, what do you do then? Do you continue looking, or do you, just the question.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, right? So do we keep doing a behavior that leads to escalation? And I'm always encouraging families to work in consultation with trained clinicians around some issues that they're concerned about. My experience is that if the behavior is eye contact may or may not function as a reinforcer for the child, but in the main, we try to avoid eye contact if we think the child's seeking our attention. If not looking at them leads to an increase in problem behavior, the question is are we just riding out an extinction burst, and what I want the parent to do is when they're calm, turn around and look at them, and that's when we should pay attention to them. When they ask nicely for your attention, that's when we should pay attention to them. So keeping steady on working through that tantrum with the avoidance of the eye contact, again, in consultation with trained professionals, and then looking over time, if the tantrum goes down, you'll know if you're riding out an extinction burst. And again, I can't say specifically what to do in this context, but if the eye contact is functioning as a reinforcer and you're doing extinction, then we want to not provide eye contact. We, of course, want to secure safety and make sure you're monitoring the child, but we would ride out that extinction burst for a period of time and then assess over time if the tantrum or the challenging behavior diminishes. And really looking for opportunities to attend to him when he is not engaged in the behavior, when he is finally no longer tantruming. But let's think proactively, what are the conditions when he is doing this to get your attention? And let's identify some activities that you can do based on the lecture here that you can do ahead of time to decrease the likelihood that he'll engage in problem behavior. So we'd think proactively, what do we want to teach him to do to get your attention? What can we do to decrease the likelihood that he'll want your attention in the first place? And then, of course, if you have the issue, looking at assessing the behavior in relationship to the eye contact.
Okay, so we just have one more question for you. Do you have any advice on how to balance constant rewards for desirable behavior for your child with autism with neurotypical siblings, where it may not be beneficial for them to learn that they should always get a reward?
That's a great question. So in the daily routine of life, the siblings may not have access to the reinforcers that the child with autism might need in order to perform. Sometimes that requires education of the siblings, like helping them to understand the needs of the child with autism, and that this child with autism is learning something new and as a result is going to have access to certain reinforcers. So it's educating the siblings. But I tell families that siblings should have reinforcer systems too. And so sometimes siblings will be on different systems to cooperate with their brother or sister engaging in certain activities in order to gain access to the reinforcer. And so kind of setting up some sibling contingencies is never a bad idea as far as I'm concerned. But I think it's a great question, and I think it's about balancing that out and looking at what's going to be least disruptive for the family overall. But it may be the case that the siblings require some education around why you're doing that and why you're providing those reinforcers and why they're important. And then over time, identifying ways to thin those out and to not use them as often, but doing it systematically. Don't go from all to nothing, but rather, hey, we're going to have to give him this treat, every 5 minutes, but guess what? Over time, we're going to give it less. And because you're being such a helpful brother or sister, you're also going to get access to certain things at certain times. So, figuring out how to incorporate the siblings in the plan so that they don't feel that their behavior is not being rewarded. Meanwhile, the child with autism is getting a lot of reinforcers. So balancing that out, really helping them to understand the reason why, but also including them somehow in the plan.
Okay, so I know I said that was the last question, but we did get a lot of questions about if these strategies would work for young adults with autism. So if you could just speak generally to that, I think some participants would appreciate that.
Sure. So we have adults here at Alpine. The school program goes to 21, and we also have an adult program. So the oldest individual receiving treatment at our program is 36, and we use these techniques. So providing structure, providing predictability, helping them to monitor their own behavior, providing reinforcers for the non-occurrence of behavior. Now, these are individuals who are out working in the community. They're functioning in my program. The adults in my program, their functioning is they're fairly challenged learners with autism, and so they require a lot of predictability, a lot of visual supports. It may be the case that there are young adults with autism who don't require the specificity of these types of interventions, but the understanding of behavior in relationship to the environment is essential across every age, and understanding the things that you can do proactively is essential for any age. So we look at behavior as a function of the environment, no matter if you're 2 or 35, and we try to be proactive in terms of the procedures that we use. So I have a young man who's 27. He loves a lot of attention. We just took him into our adult program. He loves a lot of attention. And so the life coaches in the program will give him scheduled attention to reduce the likelihood that he's going to engage in problem behavior, to seek our attention in an inappropriate way. And so same procedure we might use with a 5-year-old, the stimuli might look different. So it's not going to be a token board with smiley faces that look like they're geared towards a preschooler, but it might be a wallet that has pennies that we give because coins are age appropriate in terms of money. So it might look different, but the strategy is the same, and the methodology in terms of understanding behavior as a function of the environment is the same.
Thanks so much, Bridget. So I think that is all the time that we have for today's webinar. Thank you so much for a really amazing presentation, and also to everybody who joined us today. Just a reminder that you will be able to access a recording of this webinar as well as a downloadable and printable PDF on www.sparkforautism.org. You can also learn more about the SPARK study and join online, which takes about 20 or 30 minutes at that website, www.sparkforautism.org. And we have more webinars coming up every month. Stay tuned for those. On August 16th, Summer Bishop, a clinical psychologist and professor of psychology at the University of California, San Francisco, will be presenting. More details on that talk will be available through our newsletter and shared in the coming weeks. You can sign up for the newsletter on the website as well. We also have a 2-question survey that will automatically appear when you close your webinar window. If you're able to take a few moments to fill that out, it will help us provide you with presentations that are of the greatest value to you and the rest of the SPARK community. So we look forward to continuing this series, and thank you all again for joining.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your participation and great questions. Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.